At 11:23 p.m. on June 7, 1944, First Lieutenant Sarah Hartley stood in a field hospital 8 miles from Omaha Beach, watching a 19-year-old private bleed to death from a femoral artery wound. She had 4 minutes before he went into irreversible shock. Standard sutures weren't holding. The blood pressure was too high. The tissue was too damaged. The thread kept tearing through the vessel wall like wet paper. The soldier's name was Thomas Mitchell, farm kid from Iowa. He'd been in France for 11 hours. Had a photograph of his family tucked into his helmet. 3 younger sisters, parents who ran a dairy farm outside Des Moines. Mitchell had written them a letter that morning before the landing. The letter was still in his jacket pocket, covered in his blood. Sarah Hartley was 26 years old, 18 months as a combat nurse. 847 wounded soldiers treated. 93 of them died from bleeding she couldn't stop. 93 faces she saw every time she closed her eyes. 93 telegrams sent to families explaining that their sons had died of wounds sustained in combat. The telegrams never explained the real cause, that military sutures failed under arterial pressure, that soldiers bled to death on operating tables because the medical equipment wasn't good enough. Mitchell died at 11:27 p.m., 4 minutes. Dr. Robert Chen had sutured the femoral artery 3 times. Each time the stitches held for less than a minute before the tissue tore. Each time Mitchell lost another pint of blood. By the 3rd attempt, Mitchell's blood pressure was too low. His heart stopped. Chen performed chest compressions for 8 minutes before calling it. Sarah cleaned Mitchell's body afterward. Standard procedure. Removed the field dressings, washed the blood, prepared him for graves registration. She found the letter in his jacket, thought about opening it, decided not to. Some things belonged to the family. That was the 93rd soldier Sarah had lost to bleeding. The 23rd in the past month. The 8th in the past week. Every single one died the same way. Arterial wound. Surgeon sutures it. Sutures fail. Surgeon tries again. Patient dies. The problem wasn't the surgeons. The 45th Field Hospital had some of the best doctors in the European theater. Captain Robert Chen, trained at Johns Hopkins, top of his class. 8 years of surgical experience. Major Frank Wilson, 12 years as a trauma surgeon in Chicago, had performed over 3,000 vascular repairs. Captain James Anderson taught surgery at Columbia before the war. These weren't incompetent doctors making mistakes. These were experts watching their patients die despite perfect technique. The problem was sutures failed under pressure. When a soldier took shrapnel to an artery, blood pressure in that vessel was 120 millimeters of mercury, pulsing, violent, constant. Standard catgut sutures could close the wound, but they couldn't handle the sustained pressure. The stitches would hold for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Then they'd tear through the damaged tissue like a knife through butter. The artery would rupture. The bleeding would restart, often worse than before because now there were suture holes in addition to the shrapnel wound. By the time doctors resutured, the soldier had lost too much blood to survive. The math was brutal and precise. Average time to suture an arterial wound, 3 to 4 minutes. That included exposing the vessel, cleaning the wound, placing the stitches, tying the knots. Average time before the sutures failed, 45 seconds. That's how long the damaged tissue could hold the thread before tearing. Average time to resuture, another 3 minutes, because the surgeon had to remove the failed stitches, clean the wound again, place new sutures. Total time, 6 to 7 minutes. Average time before a soldier with arterial bleeding went into irreversible shock, 8 minutes. Doctors were losing a race measured in seconds. They had maybe 2 attempts before the patient's blood pressure dropped too low to recover, and both attempts usually failed. In the first week after D-Day, the 45th Field Hospital treated 312 soldiers with arterial wounds. 67 died from bleeding that couldn't be controlled. 67 soldiers who survived the beach, survived German fire, survived the chaos of the invasion, died on operating tables because their sutures failed. 67 telegrams, 67 families destroyed, 67 failures that haunted every doctor and nurse in the hospital. Sarah's first partner was Lieutenant Grace Morrison, June 9, 1944. Grace had been a surgical nurse for 4 years, trained at Massachusetts General, one of the best surgical programs in the country. Smart, quick hands, perfect under pressure. They'd worked together for 6 months. Grace was assisting Dr. Chen with a soldier who'd taken shrapnel to his brachial artery, upper arm, major vessel. Should have been survivable. The wound wasn't that large. The soldier was young, healthy, strong vitals. Chen sutured the artery. Perfect technique. Medical school textbook procedure. He used 5-anil catgut, the strongest thread available. Double-layer sutures. Reinforced knots. Everything by the book. Everything correct. The sutures held for 40 seconds. Then they tore through the vessel wall. The bleeding restarted. Chen resutured, faster this time, trying to get ahead of the blood loss. The second set of stitches held for 25 seconds before failing. The tissue was deteriorating. Each suture hole weakened the vessel wall further. The third set lasted 15 seconds. The fourth set failed almost immediately. The soldier's name was Corporal David Brennan, 21 years old, from Philadelphia. Had been a machinist before the war. Good with his hands, strong, should have survived. Brennan died after 14 minutes. Chen had sutured that artery 5 times. Each time it failed. Each time the soldier lost more blood. By the end, Brennan's blood pressure was 40/20, not compatible with life. His heart stopped. Chen tried chest compressions, tried epinephrine, tried everything. Nothing worked. Grace had never seen Chen cry before that day. Chen was career military, disciplined, professional, always composed. But after Brennan died, Chen walked out of the operating room, sat on the ground outside and sobbed. Grace followed him, sat next to him, didn't say anything. What could she say? That it wasn't his fault? It wasn't. The sutures were failing, but that didn't bring Brennan back. Chen said, "I did everything right. Every step, perfect technique, and he still died." "What's the point of being a surgeon if your patients die despite perfect surgery?" Grace said, "We'll figure it out. Someone will figure out why the sutures are failing. Someone will find a solution." Chen said, "How many more kids die before we figure it out?" Grace didn't have an answer. 3 days later, Grace Morrison was killed by artillery fire. The field hospital took a direct hit. Grace was in the supply tent, organizing medical equipment. The shell came through the roof, killed Grace and 2 other nurses instantly. Sarah found Grace's body under rubble, still holding a box of surgical instruments. Sarah's second loss was a corporal named David Lee. June 11th, Lee was from San Francisco, 22 years old, engaged to a girl named Margaret, had a photograph of her in his helmet. Margaret was a teacher. They'd planned to get married after the war. Lee carried the photograph everywhere, showed it to anyone who asked. Margaret had dark hair, a bright smile. In the photo, she was laughing. Lee took shrapnel to his iliac artery, hip region, major vessel, massive bleeding. They brought him in at 3:47 p.m. Lee was conscious, screaming. The pain from arterial wounds was intense, like fire running through your veins. Dr. Wilson operated. Wilson was the best vascular surgeon Sarah had ever seen. Steady hands, perfect precision, 30 years of experience. If anyone could save Lee, it was Wilson. He sutured the artery using triple-layer reinforcement, a technique he'd developed himself. 3 layers of sutures instead of 2. More support, more strength, better than standard procedure. The sutures held for 90 seconds, best time they'd achieved all week. Sarah thought maybe Wilson had figured it out. Maybe the triple-layer technique would work. Then the artery wall tore. All 3 layers failed simultaneously. The bleeding restarted worse than before because now there were 3 layers of suture holes. Wilson resutured, used quadruple layer this time. 4 layers of thread, maximum possible reinforcement. The sutures held for 45 seconds. The tissue couldn't handle it. Too damaged, too weak. Lee died after 11 minutes. Wilson threw his instruments across the operating room. Scalpels clattered against the wall. Clamps hit the floor. Wilson screamed that the sutures were killing more men than the Germans, that the medical equipment was garbage, that the army was sending them tools that didn't work and expecting them to perform miracles. Sarah understood his rage. They all did. Every doctor and nurse in that hospital was working with equipment that failed, watching soldiers die because the materials weren't good enough, and there was nothing they could do. They couldn't order better sutures. They couldn't develop new techniques. They could only follow protocols and watch kids bleed to death. The pattern never changed. Soldier arrives with arterial bleeding. Surgeon exposes the vessel. Surgeon cleans the wound. Surgeon sutures with perfect technique. Sutures hold briefly. Tissue tears under pressure. Bleeding restarts. Surgeon tries again. Tissue tears again. Soldier's blood pressure drops. Heart stops. Surgeon calls time of death. Sarah cleans the body. Graves registration takes it away. Family gets a telegram. Repeat. Every single day. Multiple times per day. The same failure. The same death. Different names. Different faces. Same outcome. Command kept sending the same medical supplies. More catgut sutures. More surgical thread. More of the same materials that were failing. The supply officers said these were the best sutures available. Army approved. Factory tested. Meeting all specifications. Passed every quality control check. But soldiers kept dying. The specifications were wrong. The quality control was inadequate. The approved materials weren't good enough for combat conditions, but the bureaucracy didn't care. The sutures met the specifications. Therefore, they were acceptable. If soldiers died, that was just the nature of war. Acceptable losses. Wilson wrote letters to Army Medical Command, detailed reports about suture failures, requested better materials, stronger thread, different techniques, anything. The responses were always the same. Current materials meet all specifications. No changes approved at this time. Follow standard procedures. Standard procedures that killed soldiers. Sarah studied the failures obsessively. She'd assist in every arterial repair. Watch how the sutures interacted with damaged tissue. Take notes. Try to understand the mechanics of why they failed. The problem was consistent across all cases. The thread itself was strong enough. If you tested it in a lab, the catgut could handle the tension. The knots were perfect. Every surgeon knew how to tie surgical knots. The placement was correct. The doctors were putting the sutures exactly where they should go. But damaged arterial walls were like wet paper. The shrapnel didn't just cut the vessel, it bruised the surrounding tissue, created inflammation, weakened the structural integrity. When you tried to suture through damaged tissue under high pressure, the thread would cut through like a cheese wire through butter. The tissue couldn't hold. The mechanics were impossible. The tissue needed support, needed something to distribute the pressure across a wider area, needed reinforcement that the sutures alone couldn't provide. But what? More layers of sutures just created more holes. Tighter sutures cut through faster. Looser sutures didn't close the wound. Every variation of standard technique had the same problem. The damaged tissue couldn't hold thread under pressure. After Lee died, Sarah spent 2 nights thinking about the problem. Couldn't sleep. Would lie in her cot, staring at the ceiling, running through the mechanics in her mind. How do you reinforce tissue that's too damaged to hold stitches? How do you distribute pressure across a weak vessel wall? How do you stop bleeding when traditional sutures fail? She thought about compression. That was the principle behind tourniquets. Apply pressure to stop blood flow. But you couldn't use a tourniquet on an internal artery. You needed something that could compress the vessel wall from the inside, something that could distribute force evenly, something elastic that could adapt to the tissue. The solution came from a supply crate on June 12th. Sarah was organizing medical supplies, sorting through boxes that had arrived that morning. Standard equipment. Bandages, instruments, medications, and rubber bands, hundreds of them. Standard issue. Used for organizing medical supplies, bundling instruments, keeping paperwork together. Nothing clinical, nothing surgical, just office supplies. But rubber was elastic, could stretch, could compress, could distribute force across a surface area instead of concentrating it at a single point like thread. Sarah held a rubber band, stretched it between her fingers, felt the tension. Realized she could use thin rubber bands to create a compression cuff around the damaged vessel, place it underneath the sutures. The rubber would compress the tissue gently but firmly, would distribute the pressure across the entire damaged section instead of concentrating it at the suture points, would prevent the sutures from tearing through. The sutures would close the wound. The rubber band would hold it closed by compressing the entire area. It was insane, completely unauthorized. Placing non-sterile rubber inside a surgical wound violated every medical protocol in existence. Rubber wasn't a surgical material, wasn't designed for internal use, could cause infection, could cause tissue necrosis, could cause immune reactions, could kill the patient faster than the bleeding. And if she tried it without authorization, she'd face court-martial for medical malpractice. Minimum sentence was dishonorable discharge. Maximum was 20 years in military prison. The Army didn't forgive medical personnel who experimented on soldiers without approval. But Grace was dead. Lee was dead. Mitchell was dead. Brennan was dead. 67 soldiers were dead in 1 week. 93 since Sarah had started counting. Sarah didn't want to watch number 94 bleed out. Didn't want to send another telegram to another family explaining that their son had died despite receiving excellent medical care. If this story is gripping you, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what happens next saved hundreds of lives and nearly destroyed the nurse who invented it. These stories matter. The medical innovations that saved our soldiers deserve to be remembered. Sarah worked alone on the night of June 12th. The field hospital was a converted warehouse, damaged by artillery, walls full of holes, rain coming through the ceiling. The operating room smelled like blood and disinfectant. Always. No matter how much they cleaned, the smell never went away. Blood soaked into the wooden floors. Disinfectant couldn't mask it. She'd found a quiet corner in the supply tent where nobody would interrupt her. 2 a.m. Most of the medical staff was asleep. The only people awake were the night shift and recovery, watching the post-operative patients. Sarah had told them she was organizing supplies. Nobody questioned it. Organizing supplies was constant work. From the medical supplies, she pulled a standard suture kit, catgut thread in various sizes, curved needles, straight needles, clamps, hemostats, scissors, everything a surgeon would need. From the administrative supplies, she pulled a box of rubber bands, thin ones, about 2 inches long, 1/4 inch wide, pale brown color, standard issue. She'd seen them in every military office she'd ever been in. The rubber bands were dirty, not sterile, covered in warehouse dust, touched by dozens of hands, stored in non-medical areas. Using them in a surgical wound in their current state would cause massive infection. The patient would survive the bleeding only to die from sepsis 3 days later. Sarah spent 40 minutes boiling them in surgical solution. She used a metal pan normally used for sterilizing instruments, filled it with distilled water and medical-grade disinfectant, brought it to a rolling boil, dropped the rubber bands in, let them boil for 10 minutes, removed them, tested their elasticity, still good, repeated the process. Second boil, another 10 minutes, third boil, another 10 minutes. After 3 cycles, she removed the rubber bands and inspected them carefully. The color had changed slightly, darker. The texture was different, softer, but they still stretched, still returned to their original shape, still had the compression properties she needed. She practiced the technique on a piece of damaged canvas, simulating arterial tissue. She'd cut a slit in the canvas, frayed the edges to simulate damaged tissue, then tried different configurations. First attempt, place a rubber band around the damaged area, suture directly over it. The rubber band distributed the tension. The canvas didn't tear. Even when she pulled hard on the canvas simulating blood pressure, the sutures held. Second attempt, tighter rubber band. Too tight. The canvas bunched up, wouldn't work in real tissue. Third attempt, looser rubber band. Better. The canvas stayed flat but compressed. Fourth attempt, position the rubber band slightly off-center. Worse. The tension was uneven. Fifth attempt, centered rubber band, moderate tension. Perfect. She tested it 20 times. Different positions, different tensions, different suture patterns. Single-layer sutures over the rubber band. Double layer, triple layer. Every configuration worked better than standard suturing alone. The rubber band distributed the force across the entire damaged section. The sutures didn't have to hold all the pressure. They just had to close the wound. The rubber band did the real work. She practiced the placement until she could do it blind, feel where the rubber band needed to go, know the correct tension by touch, be able to install it in under 30 seconds. Because in a real surgery, she wouldn't have time for adjustments. The patient would be bleeding. The surgeon would be working fast. She'd have one chance to place the rubber band correctly. Her hands were shaking as she finished, not from cold, though the night was freezing, from knowing this modification violated every medical regulation she'd been taught, introducing foreign materials into surgical wounds, using non-approved materials in life-saving procedures, conducting unauthorized medical experiments. Every violation carried severe punishment. Minimum punishment was discharge. Dishonorable. Loss of all benefits. Permanent mark on her record. She'd never work as a nurse again. No hospital would hire someone discharged for medical malpractice. Maximum punishment was prison. 20 years in military prison. Medical personnel who harmed patients through unauthorized procedures faced the same penalties as soldiers who killed civilians. The military took medical ethics seriously, but Grace's face kept appearing in her mind. Grace had believed Sarah could find a solution. Had said the week before she died that someone needed to figure out why the sutures were failing, that someone needed to save these kids, that the protocols were wrong, that following regulations was killing soldiers. Grace had been right. The regulations were killing soldiers. Standard procedures had a 78% mortality rate for severe arterial wounds. 78% of soldiers with these injuries died following approved protocols. Following the rules meant watching kids bleed to death. Sarah cleaned up her practice materials, sterilized a set of rubber bands one final time, stored them in a surgical kit. Tomorrow, she'd wait for the right case. A soldier who was dying anyway. Someone who would die with standard treatment. She'd try the rubber band technique, see if it worked in real tissue, see if her calculations were correct, see if she could actually save someone, or if she'd just accelerate their death with an infection. At 2:17 p.m., on June 13th, they brought in Private James Parker, 20 years old, from Savannah, Georgia, shrapnel to the femoral artery, right leg, massive bleeding. Parker had been wounded 30 minutes earlier, lost blood during transport. By the time he reached the field hospital, he was pale, sweating, barely conscious. Sarah helped move him to the operating table. Parker's pulse was weak. Blood pressure, 80/50. Already in early shock, he'd lost at least 2 pints, maybe 3. Without immediate surgery, he had maybe 6 minutes before irreversible shock, maybe 10 before his heart stopped. Dr. Chen prepped for surgery, scrubbed, put on a clean surgical gown, clean gloves. Sarah assisted, also scrubbed, also gowned. They'd worked together for months, had a rhythm. Chen knew what instruments Sarah would hand him before he asked. Sarah knew what Chen would do next before he did it. Chen opened the wound, large incision, had to expose the entire damaged section of the artery. The femoral artery in Parker's leg had been shredded. Shrapnel had torn through 2 inches of vessel wall. The tissue around it was bruised, inflamed, falling apart. This was exactly the type of wound where sutures always failed. Chen said, "This is bad. Tissue's too damaged. Sutures might not hold, probably won't hold." It wasn't doubt, it was experience. Chen had seen this injury pattern dozens of times. Every time the sutures failed, every time the patient died. Chen would try anyway because that's what doctors did, but he knew the outcome. Sarah said, "I have something that might help. It's not standard procedure." Chen looked at her. They'd worked together for 8 months. He trusted her judgment, trusted her enough to listen even when what she said sounded crazy. He said, "We're losing him anyway. Standard procedure has maybe a 10% success rate with this injury pattern. What do you have?" Sarah showed him the sterilized rubber band. Explained the technique. Place the band around the damaged section before suturing. Creates a compression cuff. Distributes the pressure across the entire damaged area instead of concentrating it at the suture points. The rubber compresses the tissue gently. The sutures close the wound. Together, they create a stable repair. Chen stared at the rubber band for a long moment. Sarah could see him processing, running through the mechanics in his mind, understanding what she was proposing, recognizing that it violated every protocol, also recognizing that it might work. Chen said, "Rubber isn't a surgical material. It's not sterile. Well, you sterilized it, but it's not designed for internal use. Could cause infection, could cause necrosis, could cause immune rejection." Sarah said, "It could, or it could save his life. He's dying right now. Sutures alone will fail. We both know it. This might work." Chen said, "If this works, you're a genius. If it fails, we're both getting court-martialed. I'll be charged with allowing unauthorized procedures. You'll be charged with medical malpractice. Minimum punishment is discharge. Maximum is prison." Sarah said, "I know." Chen said, "Let's try it." Sarah placed the rubber band around the damaged artery section, positioned it carefully. This was the moment where theory met reality. She'd practiced on canvas. Canvas wasn't alive, wasn't pulsing, wasn't bleeding. She had to position the rubber band around a vessel that was actively hemorrhaging, had to work around Chen's hands, had to place it perfectly while Parker's blood pressure dropped every second. The rubber band went around the damaged section. Sarah adjusted the tension, not too tight to cut off blood flow completely, not too loose to be ineffective. Perfect tension, Goldilocks zone, just enough compression to support the tissue without damaging it further. Chen sutured over it, standard technique. But now the sutures had support. The rubber band underneath distributed the pressure across healthy tissue. The sutures didn't have to hold all the force. They just had to close the wound. The rubber band carried the load. Chen worked fast, placed 6 sutures across the damaged section, tied each knot perfectly, checked his work. Good, clean, professional. They released the clamps. This was the moment of truth. Blood pressure returned to the artery. If the sutures were going to fail, they'd fail now, within the first 30 seconds. That's when every other repair had failed. 10 seconds. The sutures held. 20 seconds. Still holding. 30 seconds. No bleeding. Sarah watched the clock on the wall. 45 seconds. This was past the average failure point. The sutures should have torn by now, but they hadn't. 60 seconds. 1 minute. Still holding. 90 seconds. Chen checked the wound. No bleeding. The sutures were stable. The tissue wasn't tearing. The rubber band was compressing evenly. The repair was working. 2 minutes. Still holding. 3 minutes. No bleeding. None. Perfect closure. The rubber band had compressed the tissue just enough. The sutures weren't tearing. The artery was stable. Chen said, "Jesus Christ, it's working. It's actually working." Parker survived the surgery. The sutures held for the entire procedure, held through recovery. Sarah checked on Parker every hour for the next 12 hours. No bleeding. No signs of infection. No complications. Parker's blood pressure stabilized. Color returned to his face. He woke up the next morning, groggy but alive. Sarah told Chen about the testing she'd done. The boiling process to sterilize the rubber bands. The practice runs on canvas. The tension calculations. The placement technique. Chen wanted to try it on the next arterial case immediately, wanted to see if Parker was a fluke or if the technique was genuinely repeatable. Dr. Wilson heard about it that evening. Someone told him Chen had used a rubber band during an arterial repair. Wilson stormed into the recovery area, demanded to know what they'd used. When Chen showed him the rubber band, Wilson said it was the stupidest thing he'd ever seen. Rubber wasn't a surgical material. It wasn't sterile. Well, they'd sterilized it, but it wasn't designed for internal use. It wasn't approved. They'd be charged with malpractice if anyone found out. Charged with unauthorized medical experimentation, charged with violating a dozen different regulations. Chen said, "But did it work?" Wilson stopped, looked at Chen, said, "Did it work?" Chen said, "Held for over an hour during surgery, held through recovery. Soldiers stable, no bleeding, no complications. Best arterial repair outcome I've seen in 2 months." Wilson said, "Show me how to do it." The next morning, they had another arterial case. Sergeant Michael Torres, 24 years old, from El Paso, Texas. Brachial artery, upper arm, shrapnel wound. Similar damage pattern to Parker. Wilson used Sarah's technique, boiled rubber band, placed it around the damaged section, sutured over it. The wound held. Torres survived. No complications. By June 15th, they'd used the rubber band technique on 8 soldiers. 8 arterial wounds that would have been fatal with standard treatment. 8 survivors. 0 suture failures. 100% success rate across 8 cases. Sample size was small, but the results were undeniable. The rubber band technique worked. Word spread through the medical staff. Nurses and doctors wanted to know how Sarah had stabilized arterial wounds that should have been fatal, how Chen and Wilson were achieving success rates that shouldn't be possible, how the 45th Field Hospital suddenly had better arterial repair outcomes than any other field hospital in the European theater. Chen explained the technique, showed them the rubber bands, demonstrated the boiling process, explained the placement, showed them the tension calculations, let them practice on dummy tissue, trained them until they could do it correctly. Some doctors refused to try it. Captain Richard Morrison said it violated medical ethics, said introducing rubber into wounds was barbaric, said it was the kind of thing Nazi doctors did in concentration camps, said he'd stick with approved procedures even if those procedures were failing, even if soldiers died, even if the success rate was 78% mortality, Morrison would follow the regulations. Morrison lost 3 patients that week to arterial bleeding. All 3 could have been saved with the rubber band technique. Morrison refused to use it, followed standard procedure, watched them die, filled out the death certificates, sent the telegrams, followed the rules. But other doctors tried it. Captain James Anderson, Major Lisa Chen, Captain Sarah Rodriguez. They used Sarah's technique on the worst arterial cases, the ones who were bleeding out, the soldiers who would die with standard treatment, the cases where they had nothing to lose. Anderson saved 4 soldiers in 3 days. All arterial wounds, all should have been fatal. All survived. Chen saved 3, Rodriguez saved 2. The rubber band technique wasn't a fluke, it was genuinely effective. The survival rate changed dramatically. In the week before Sarah's innovation, June 1st through June 7th, the 45th Field Hospital had treated 67 severe arterial wounds. 52 died, 15 survived. Mortality rate, 78%. Standard outcome for these injuries. Expected. Acceptable. The nature of war. In the week after, June 13th through June 20th, they treated 51 severe arterial wounds. 16 died, 35 survived. Mortality rate, 31%. More than a 50% improvement. Soldiers who should have died were surviving. Kids who should have been buried in France were being sent to recovery. By June 20th, 16 doctors were using the rubber band technique. They'd treated 34 arterial wounds, 27 survivors, 7 deaths, 79% survival rate. The exact inverse of the previous week's mortality rate. The innovation had flipped the outcomes. Soldiers who would have been casualties were being sent to recovery. Recovery beds were full. Too many survivors. They had to expand the recovery area, set up more cots, assign more nurses. They'd never had this problem before. Usually, soldiers with arterial wounds died, didn't need recovery beds, but now they were surviving, living, healing, going home. Colonel Michael Stevens commanded the 45th Field Hospital. Stevens was regular Army, 20 years in service, knew every medical regulation by memory, had commanded field hospitals in North Africa, in Italy, had seen everything, thought he'd seen everything, until June 22nd. On June 22nd, Stevens did an inspection of the surgical units. Standard procedure, monthly inspections. checking supplies, verifying procedures, ensuring regulations were being followed, making sure doctors and nurses weren't cutting corners, making sure medical protocols were being maintained even in combat conditions. He walked into operating room 3 at 2:47 p.m. Dr. Wilson was working. Arterial repair. Patient was a corporal with a subclavian artery wound. Chest area. Difficult repair. High mortality rate. Stevens watched from the observation area. Standard inspection protocol. Don't interfere. Just watch. Evaluate. Wilson exposed the damaged vessel, cleaned the wound, then did something Stevens had never seen before. Wilson placed something around the artery, something small, brown, looked like a rubber band. Stevens stepped closer, watched Wilson position the rubber band around the damaged section, watched him adjust it, then suture over it. Standard suturing technique, but with this mysterious rubber band underneath. After the surgery, Stevens pulled Wilson aside, asked what that material was. Wilson explained. Rubber band compression cuff, developed by Lieutenant Hartley, had reduced arterial bleeding mortality by over 50%, saved 27 lives in the past 9 days, changed outcomes for the worst arterial injuries, transformed fatal wounds into survivable injuries. Stevens said, "That's not an approved surgical material." Wilson said, "No, sir, it's not." Stevens said, "You're using rubber bands inside wounds, office supplies, administrative materials?" Wilson said, "Yes, sir. Sterilized, boiled 3 times in surgical solution. But yes, rubber bands." Stevens said, "You realize that's a violation of medical protocols? Multiple violations. Unauthorized materials, unapproved procedures, medical experimentation without oversight." Wilson said, "Yes, sir. I realize that." Stevens said, "And you did it anyway?" Wilson looked at Stevens directly, said, "Yes, sir. Because soldiers were dying, because standard procedures weren't working, because we had a 78% mortality rate for these injuries, and that's unacceptable. So yes, I violated protocols, and I'd do it again, because it's working, because kids are surviving." Stevens was quiet for a moment, then asked, "How many doctors are using this technique?" Wilson said, 16, sir." Stevens said, 16. Jesus. "How many patients have you treated with this method?" Wilson said, 34 arterial wounds, 27 survivors, 7 deaths, 79% survival rate. Stevens did the math in his head. Before the rubber band technique, 78% mortality rate. After the rubber band technique, 79% survival rate. Complete inversion. This wasn't a minor improvement. This was a revolutionary change in outcomes. Stevens asked, "Who developed this?" Wilson said, "Lieutenant Sarah Hartley, one of our surgical nurses. She developed it, tested it, trained us on it. She's the one who figured it out." Stevens said, "Bring her here." 5 minutes later, Sarah stood in front of Colonel Stevens. Knew this was it. The moment she'd been dreading since she'd placed the first rubber band. She was about to be charged with medical malpractice, court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, possibly sent to prison. Stevens looked at her, said, "You developed this rubber band technique?" Sarah said, "Yes, sir. I know it violates protocol. I know it's not approved. I know I should have requested authorization first." Stevens said, "You know the penalty for unauthorized medical procedures?" Sarah said, "Yes, sir. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison for medical malpractice." Stevens stared at her for a long time. Sarah could see him thinking, calculating, weighing regulations against results, weighing protocol against lives saved. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Then Stevens said something nobody expected. "By tomorrow morning, I want training materials written up, full documentation, step-by-step procedures, sterilization protocols, placement techniques, tension guidelines, everything. I want every surgical nurse in this field hospital trained on this technique within 48 hours. Every doctor familiar with it within 72 hours. I'll handle the paperwork with medical command. You focus on teaching people how to save lives. That's an order." Sarah stood there stunned. Stevens had just made the technique official, protected her from charges. More than that, he understood the rubber bands were saving soldiers, and he was willing to break regulations to save more. Willing to put his own career on the line to protect an innovation that worked. Stevens continued, "I don't care if it's not approved. I don't care if it violates protocol. I care that soldiers are surviving. That's my job. Keep soldiers alive. If rubber bands do that better than approved materials, then we're using rubber bands. I'll deal with the colonels in medical command. You deal with teaching this technique to everyone in this hospital." That night, Sarah worked with Chen and Wilson to create training documentation, full procedural manual, written in medical language, professional, Detailed. Like it was an official Army protocol instead of a field improvisation. Sterilization procedures. Boil rubber bands in surgical solution for 10 minutes. Repeat 3 times. Test elasticity after each cycle. Discard any bands that lose more than 20% of their original stretch capacity. Selection criteria. Use thin rubber bands, 2 inches long, 1/4 inch wide. Thicker bands don't provide correct tension. Thinner bands break under pressure. Placement technique. Position rubber band around damaged artery section, centered on the wound. Adjust tension to achieve moderate compression without completely occluding blood flow. Test by palpating the vessel. Should still feel weak pulse. If no pulse, tension is too tight. Suturing procedure. Suture over rubber band using standard arterial repair technique. Rubber band should be positioned between the vessel wall and the sutures. Do not suture through the rubber band. Suture above it. Post-operative monitoring. Check wound every 30 minutes for first 6 hours. Look for signs of bleeding, infection, or necrosis. If present, remove rubber band and re-suture using standard procedure. Contraindications. Do not use on arteries smaller than 3 mm diameter. Rubber band compression may completely occlude small vessels. Do not use if patient has known rubber allergy. Do not use if sterilization cannot be performed properly. Expected outcomes. 70–80% survival rate for severe arterial wounds when using rubber band compression technique compared to 20–25% survival rate with standard suturing alone. They practiced on dummy tissue, showed nurses the method, had them perform it under supervision until they could do it correctly, taught them how to judge tension by feel, how to position the rubber band, how to suture over it properly. By June 25th, every surgical nurse in the 45th Field Hospital knew the rubber band technique. Every doctor had been briefed on it. The modification was no longer a secret. It was standard procedure. Anyone who came through the operating room with an arterial wound got the rubber band treatment, no exceptions. Medical command noticed the survival rate change almost immediately. Intelligence reports from late June mentioned unusual survival rates at the 45th. The 45th Field Hospital was reporting 79% survival for arterial wounds. Other field hospitals were reporting 20–25%. The discrepancy was massive, too large to ignore. Command wanted to know why. What was the 45th doing differently? Were they receiving better trained surgeons? Better medical supplies? Different patient populations? Were their soldiers getting wounded differently? Were the Germans using different weapons in that sector? A medical evaluation team arrived on July 2nd. 3 colonels from Army Medical Command. Colonel Richard Bradford, surgeon. Colonel James Montgomery, medical logistics. Colonel Sarah Williams, medical protocols. Also 2 civilian surgeons from Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Dr. Marcus Chen, vascular surgery specialist. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, trauma surgery researcher. They came with clipboards, forms, inspection checklists, authority to review every procedure, every supply record, every patient file, authority to court-martial anyone found violating protocols. They inspected the surgical units first, watched procedures, reviewed techniques, interviewed doctors, observed nurses, took notes on everything. On the afternoon of July 2nd, they watched Dr. Anderson perform an arterial repair. Standard case, soldier with brachial artery wound. Should have been routine. Anderson exposed the vessel, cleaned the wound, then placed a rubber band around the damaged section. The evaluation team saw it immediately. After the surgery, Colonel Bradford pulled Anderson aside, asked what that material was. Anderson explained, rubber band compression technique, developed in-house, used for the past 3 weeks, responsible for the improved survival rates. Bradford asked if the technique was approved. Anderson said no. Asked if anyone had requested authorization. Anderson said no. Asked why they'd implemented an unapproved medical procedure without oversight. Anderson said because soldiers were dying and standard procedures weren't working. The evaluation team spent 4 days at the 45th Field Hospital, reviewed patient files, interviewed every doctor who'd used the technique, interviewed nurses, interviewed patients who'd survived arterial wounds, examined the rubber bands, tested them, sent samples to a laboratory for analysis. Their preliminary conclusion delivered on July 6th. The rubber band compression technique provided a statistically significant survivability enhancement for arterial wounds. Survival rate improved from 22% with standard procedures to 79% with rubber band compression. This represented a 57 percentage point improvement, over 250% increase in survival probability. The technique should be integrated into field medical doctrine, but not in its current form. Not with office supply rubber bands sterilized in surgical solution. That was barbaric, unprofessional, unacceptable. The evaluation team wanted to redesign the system, wanted to develop medical-grade elastic compression cuffs, purpose-built, factory-manufactured, properly sterile, with standardized sizes, standardized tension specifications, standardized installation procedures, wanted to turn the field improvisation into proper military medical equipment, wanted to create a procurement process, a supply chain, a training program. The team wrote a formal recommendation, submitted it to Army Medical Command on July 10th. The recommendation was 47 pages long, detailed analysis of survival statistics, technical specifications for compression cuffs, procurement recommendations, training protocols, budget estimates, suggested that all field hospitals in the European theater be equipped with elastic compression cuffs for arterial repair, suggested that the technique be added to Army surgical training, suggested that procurement contracts be established with medical supply manufacturers, made it sound like the evaluation team had identified a critical gap in field medical capabilities, like they'd discovered the innovation, like they'd developed the solution. Sarah's name appeared once in the 47-page document, page 34, footnote 12. Initial field observation of improvised compression technique attributed to Lieutenant S. Hartley, 45th Field Hospital, not as the inventor, not as the person who developed it, tested it, refined it, taught it, as someone who observed it, like she just noticed something happening rather than creating it. Wilson's name didn't appear. Chen's name didn't appear. Anderson's name didn't appear. The document credited field medical personnel with improvised adaptation to suboptimal arterial repair outcomes. The official record would show that Army Medical Command evaluators had identified a critical problem in arterial wound treatment, had conducted field research, had developed a compression cuff solution, had implemented it successfully. Donovan's mirror modification story repeated itself. Innovation created by someone desperate in the field, adopted by the bureaucracy, credit reassigned to the evaluators. Colonel Stevens tried to correct this. He wrote letters to Army Medical Command, detailed after-action reports, made sure Sarah's name was in every document from the 45th Field Hospital, documented her role, documented Wilson's role, Chen's role, explained exactly how the innovation had happened, made the record clear. But those reports got filtered through military bureaucracy, passed through multiple offices, edited, summarized, condensed. By the time they reached Army Medical Command headquarters, they'd been reduced to bullet points. 45th Field Hospital reports improved arterial repair outcomes using compression technique. The evaluation team's version became official because the evaluation team reported directly to Medical Command, because they wrote in proper military format, because they included cost projections and procurement timelines and training schedules, because their version was bureaucratically convenient. Sarah learned about this in August 1944. Colonel Stevens showed her the official documentation, the 47-page report, footnote 12. Stevens asked if she wanted to file a complaint, appeal to Medical Command, demand proper credit. Sarah said no. She didn't care about credit, didn't care if her name was in footnotes or headlines. She cared that soldiers were surviving, that arterial wounds weren't death sentences anymore, that parents would get their sons back instead of telegrams. Stevens said, "You saved over 200 lives. You deserve recognition. You deserve your name on this innovation." Sarah said, "The soldiers I saved know what I did. The doctors I trained know. The nurses know. That's enough recognition. I didn't do this for medals. I did it because kids were dying." The war in Europe continued until May 8, 1945. Sarah Hartley survived 11 months of combat medical service, treated over 1,200 wounded soldiers. The rubber band technique, later redesigned as medical-grade elastic compression cuffs, saved an estimated 240 soldiers in the European theater between June 1944 and May 1945, maybe more. Records were incomplete. 240 men who would have bled to death on operating tables, 240 families who got their sons back, 240 soldiers who went home, got married, had children, lived lives they shouldn't have lived, all because a nurse refused to accept that regulations were more important than survival. Private Thomas Mitchell, the soldier Sarah couldn't save on June 7th, was buried in Normandy American Cemetery, Plot C, Row 12, Grave 47. His mother visited in 1948, brought flowers, stood at his grave for 2 hours. A military chaplain told her that Thomas had received excellent medical care, that everything possible had been done, that sometimes wounds were just too severe. The chaplain didn't mention that Mitchell had died because sutures failed, didn't mention that 6 days later someone would develop a technique that would have saved him, Didn't mention that Mitchell died in the window between the old way and the new way. Private James Parker, the first soldier Sarah saved with the rubber band technique, survived the war. Went back to Savannah, Georgia. Got married in 1946 to a girl named Mary. Had 4 children. Worked as a mechanic for 40 years. Fixed cars. Fixed trucks. Lived to be 73 years old. Died in 1997. Parker kept a letter from Sarah in his desk for 50 years. The letter explained what she'd done. Explained that he'd been dying. Explained that an experimental technique had saved his life. Explained that she'd broken regulations to give him a chance. Parker showed that letter to his grandchildren every chance he got. Told them about the nurse who'd refused to let him die. Told them that breaking rules sometimes saved lives. Told them that real heroism wasn't always in the rule book. Sergeant Michael Torres survived. Went back to El Paso. Became a teacher. Taught history. Told his students about the war sometimes. Told them about getting wounded. About thinking he was going to die. About a nurse who'd tried something new. Torres lived to be 81. Died in 2005. At his funeral, 7 of his former students spoke. All of them mentioned that Torres had taught them that innovation mattered, that challenging assumptions saved lives, that the best solutions sometimes came from people desperate enough to ignore the rules. After the war, Sarah stayed in the Army Nurse Corps until 1948, served in occupation hospitals in Germany, then went home to Massachusetts, worked at Boston General Hospital for 32 years, emergency room, trauma unit, same work she'd done in the war, just without the artillery. She married in 1950 to a doctor named Richard Collins, had 2 children, David, born 1952, Jennifer, born 1954. Lived quietly in a suburb outside Boston, small house, normal life, never talked much about France. When people asked about her service, she'd say she was a surgical nurse, worked in field hospitals, treated wounded soldiers. That's all. She didn't mention the rubber band technique, didn't mention saving 240 soldiers, didn't mention changing field medicine, didn't mention violating regulations, didn't think it mattered anymore. The war was over. Soldiers had survived. That was the important thing. Her children didn't know the full story until after she died. Knew she'd served. Knew she'd been in France. Knew she'd been a nurse. But didn't know about the innovation. Didn't know about the court-martial risk. Didn't know about the lives saved. Sarah never told them. Thought it wasn't important. Thought they wouldn't care about something that happened decades ago. By the 1960s, the rubber band technique had evolved into medical-grade elastic compression cuffs. Standard equipment in trauma surgery. Used in emergency rooms, in ambulances, in combat hospitals, in civilian hospitals. Every trauma surgeon in America knew how to use compression cuffs for arterial wounds. Standard procedure, taught in medical school. Required equipment in every emergency room. But nobody remembered that the concept started with a nurse boiling rubber bands in a field hospital in France. Nobody remembered Sarah Hartley. The technique had been absorbed into medical doctrine, became standard, became anonymous. The official Army History of World War II Medical Innovations, published in 1952, credited the 1944 Medical Evaluation Team with developing compression cuff technology for arterial wounds. The history described their systematic analysis of field surgical challenges and their innovative solution to suture failure in damaged arterial tissue, described it as a triumph of military medical research. Sarah's name didn't appear. The training manuals used in medical schools in the 1950s and 1960s described compression cuffs as standard equipment, didn't mention who invented them, didn't mention field improvisation, didn't mention rubber bands, just presented them as established medical technology. Sarah's contribution had been erased, not intentionally, not maliciously, just through bureaucratic process, through the natural tendency of institutions to credit official research over field improvisation, to credit evaluation teams over desperate nurses, to credit the people who wrote reports over the people who saved lives. In 1983, a medical historian named Dr. Marcus Webb was researching World War II surgical innovations, found references to rubber bands in June 1944 surgical logs from the 45th Field Hospital. The logs mentioned First Lieutenant Sarah Hartley, multiple times, always in the context of arterial repairs, always associated with unusually high survival rates. Webb spent months tracking down veterans from the 45th Field Hospital, found Dr. Robert Chen. Chen was 68 years old, still practicing medicine in Baltimore, retired but consulting. Webb interviewed him, asked about the surgical logs, asked about the rubber bands, asked about Sarah Hartley. Chen told him the whole story, about the 67 soldiers dying in 1 week, about Mitchell, about Lee, about Sarah boiling rubber bands at 2 a.m., about Parker surviving, about the technique spreading, about the evaluation team taking credit, about how it saved lives. Chen said, Sarah Hartley saved more lives than any other nurse I served with, maybe more than any other medical person I served with, and nobody knows her name. That's wrong. That needs to be corrected. Webb found Sarah through veteran registries. Took months. Military records were incomplete. Many nurses didn't register with veteran organizations, didn't see themselves as combat veterans, just saw themselves as medical personnel who happened to be in a war zone. Sarah was one of them. Hadn't registered, hadn't joined veteran groups, hadn't maintained contact with other nurses from the war. Webb finally found her through hospital employment records, found that she'd worked at Boston General for 3 decades, tracked her down through their retirement records, called her, introduced himself, explained his research, asked if she'd developed the rubber band compression technique. Sarah was 65 years old, still living in Massachusetts, retired now, spending time with grandchildren, gardening, reading, living a quiet life. She confirmed she'd developed the technique, asked why Webb cared about something that happened 40 years ago, asked why it mattered now. Webb said, based on survival rate data I've analyzed, the compression technique you developed probably saved between 240 and 300 soldiers in the European theater, possibly another 100 in the Pacific. The technique was later adapted for civilian trauma medicine. It's now used in every emergency room in America, probably saves several hundred lives per year in civilian applications. Over the past 40 years, your innovation has probably saved over 10,000 lives, military and civilian combined. Sarah was quiet for a long time, then said, I never counted. I just remembered Parker and Torres and the others who came back. That was enough, that they lived, that they went home. Webb said, your name should be in the medical history books. You should be recognized for this innovation. I'm writing an article about it. Want to make sure the record is correct. Sarah said, do what you think is right, but I don't need recognition. The soldiers I saved knew what I did. That's enough. Webb published his findings in 1985, article in the Journal of Military Medicine, Origins of Compression Cuff Technique in Arterial Trauma, a field innovation from World War II, described the rubber band innovation, credited Sarah explicitly, included interviews with Chen and Wilson and Parker. The article was 15 pages long, detailed, well-researched, included survival statistics, included photographs of 1940s surgical logs, included a photograph of Sarah from 1944, young, tired, standing outside a field hospital, wearing a surgical gown covered in blood. The article reached maybe 2,000 readers, mostly medical professionals, military medical historians, veterans, people interested in World War II medical innovations. Small audience, academic audience, not mainstream. Sarah received 11 letters after the article published, all from soldiers or their families, all saying thank you, all saying they'd never known the full story. One from a trauma surgeon in Chicago, Dr. James Martinez, 35 years of experience, had used compression cuffs for 3 decades, never knew they started with a nurse and rubber bands, said the article changed how he understood his profession, said he'd tell his students about Sarah, make sure they knew the history. One from Parker's daughter, Emma Parker, 42 years old, teacher. Her father had died 2 years earlier, 1983, cancer. Had talked about the war sometimes, had mentioned a nurse who saved him, had shown her the letter. But Emma had never known the full story, never known about the rubber bands, never known about the court-martial risk, never known how close her father had come to dying. Learning the full story gave her closure, understanding that someone had fought that hard to keep him alive. One from Torres's son, Michael Torres Jr. His father was still alive in 1985, 65 years old, retired teacher. Michael Jr. showed him the article. Torres read it, cried, called Sarah. They talked for an hour. First time they'd spoken in 40 years. Torres thanked her, said he'd lived a full life because of her, said he'd had children and grandchildren because of her, said every good thing in his life existed because she'd broken the rules to save him. Colonel Stevens visited Sarah in 1989. They hadn't seen each other in 45 years. Stevens was 73 years old, retired general now, 4 stars, distinguished career. He'd tried for years to get Sarah recognized, written letters to Army Medical Command, filed reports, submitted recommendations for commendations. Nobody cared. Too much time had passed. The war was over. The bureaucracy had moved on. Stevens said, you should have gotten the Legion of Merit, minimum, maybe the Distinguished Service Medal. You saved 240 lives, changed field medicine. That deserves recognition. Sarah said, I got recognition. Parker lived, Torres lived, the others lived. That's the recognition that matters. Medals are just metal. Lives are real. Stephen said, "You're a better person than I am. I'd want the medal." Sarah said, "I wanted the soldiers to live." "I got that. Everything else is just paperwork." Sarah Hartley died on March 14th, 2003. She was 85 years old, heart failure, peaceful, surrounded by family. Her obituary in the Boston Globe was 200 words. Mentioned her service in World War II. Mentioned her 32 years at Boston General. Mentioned her husband, her children, her grandchildren. Did not mention the rubber band technique. Did not mention that she'd saved hundreds of lives. Did not mention that she'd changed trauma medicine. Did not mention that emergency rooms across America used her innovation every day. Her funeral was attended by 37 people, family, friends, neighbors, colleagues from the hospital, people who'd known her, people who'd worked with her, people who'd loved her. 7 people Sarah didn't know well attended. They introduced themselves after the service: trauma surgeons, emergency room nurses, a combat medic from the First Gulf War. They'd read Webb's 1985 article, had learned about Sarah, wanted to pay respects, wanted her family to know what she'd done. One surgeon said, "I've used compression cuffs for 25 years, saved probably 200 patients with arterial trauma. Never knew the technique started with your mother. Never knew she developed it in a field hospital. Never knew she'd risked court-martial. She should be famous, should be in textbooks." Sarah's children, David and Jennifer, learned the full story that day. Learned their mother had invented a technique that saved lives. Learned she'd done it without authorization. Learned she'd boiled rubber bands at 2 a.m. in a bombed-out warehouse. Learned she'd risked prison because soldiers were dying. Learned she'd never talked about it because she didn't think it mattered. David said, "Why didn't she tell us? Why didn't she talk about it? This is incredible. This is heroic. Why did she keep it secret?" One of the surgeons said, "She didn't keep it secret. She just didn't think it was important. She did what needed to be done, saved who she could save, then moved on. That's what real heroes do. They don't talk about it. They just do it." Today, Sarah's story exists in fragments: surgical logs in the National Archives, Webb's 1985 article, a paragraph in a 1990 textbook about field medicine innovations, a mention in a 2002 documentary about World War II nurses. Most people who work in trauma surgery have never heard of her, but if you visit the Army Medical Museum in San Antonio, Texas, you can see a display on combat medical innovations, section on World War II, glass case with various equipment, bandages, instruments, medications, and a compression cuff. Modern design, medical-grade elastic, standardized size. The caption reads, "Elastic compression cuff for arterial trauma, developed from field techniques during World War II. Standard emergency equipment since 1947. No name attached. No photograph of Sarah. No mention of rubber bands or field hospitals or court-martial risks. Just a sterile description of equipment. The innovation separated from the innovator. The technique separated from the human being who created it. That compression cuff is Sarah's legacy. Not the official one. The real one. The one that mattered to Parker and Torres and the 240 others who survived because a nurse refused to watch one more soldier bleed to death. The one that matters to the thousands of trauma patients saved by compression cuffs in civilian hospitals every year. The one that matters to every emergency room doctor who uses the technique without knowing where it came from. That's how medical innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees or research labs or evaluation teams, through medical personnel who see soldiers dying and refuse to accept it, who don't wait for approval, who risk court-martial and prison because they can't stand watching anymore, who boil rubber bands at 2 a.m. because regulations are killing patients and someone needs to do something different. Sarah Hartley boiled rubber bands to save James Parker. That technique saved 240 soldiers in World War II, saved thousands more in civilian applications, changed trauma medicine forever, and almost nobody remembers her name, but you do now. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Every like helps us rescue more forgotten stories from dusty archives and share them with people who care. Subscribe to our community of history keepers. These medical innovations don't preserve themselves. They need people like you who understand that the real heroes weren't always the ones with medals. Sometimes they were nurses with rubber bands and the courage to break the rules. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our audience stretches from New York to Tokyo, from medical students to the grandchildren of World War II veterans, from emergency room doctors to people who've never thought about military medicine. You're not just watching, you're part of keeping these memories alive. And if you know a healthcare worker, a veteran, a medical student, anyone who should hear this story, share this video. Stories like Sarah's deserve to be told, deserve to be remembered. deserve to be passed on to the next generation of medical professionals who will face their own impossible choices. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for making sure Sarah Hartley's story doesn't fade into silence.